As my husband lay in a coma, his sister filed an emergency petition for a DNA test, publicly claiming my son was a fraud so she could inherit everything. When the results printed, they proved paternity and uncovered who had poisoned him. The coffee cup slipped out of Camille's hand at 10:14 on a Thursday morning, and by the time it finished shattering against the hardwood floor of Rosalind Kessler's office, she wasn't crying about the son she'd spent a month calling a fraud. She was staring at a second sheet of paper she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, and her face had gone the color of the porcelain in pieces around her shoes. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt my own hands shaking so hard I had to press them flat against my knees to keep the room from tilting, because I had just watched a month of my life. My husband's coma, my son's blood drawn twice, weeks of being called a liar across a hospital cafeteria table, collapse into a single fact none of us had been looking for. But to understand how a DNA test built to destroy me ended up destroying her instead, you have to go back a month to a Sunday morning that started with the smell of coffee and ended with my husband seizing on our kitchen floor. I'd been married to Callum Price for 9 years, long enough that I could tell the difference between the silence he made when he was worried about money and the silence he made when he was worried about his sister. That Sunday, he was pouring 2 coffees, one for him, one for me, into the chipped blue mug I'd been meaning to replace since our first apartment, when he stopped mid-sentence about our son's soccer schedule and dropped straight to the floor. He was seizing before I even got the phone to my ear. Our son Bodhi was in the next room with the cartoons turned up too loud, and I remember being grateful for exactly one thing in the entire ordeal: that a 7-year-old didn't have to watch his father's eyes roll back. Callum worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm downtown, the kind of job that kept the mortgage current and put a little away each month, nothing more. He drove a 12-year-old pickup he refused to trade in, still had the takeout menu from our first date stuck to the fridge next to the lighthouse magnet, and coached Bodhi's rec league soccer team on Saturday mornings. Even though he couldn't reliably call an offside, he was not, by any stretch, sitting on a fortune. That detail mattered more than anyone expected later, when a woman who badly needed money went looking for some anyway. He used to say his sister had spent her whole life a half step behind everyone else's expectations, and had never quite forgiven any of us for noticing. The ER doctors called it a hemorrhagic stroke, rare for a 41-year-old with no family history of it, they told me, in the careful tone doctors use right before they stop promising anything. He might wake up, he might not. There was no way to know yet, and I would learn to hate that sentence the way you hate a song that gets stuck in your head against your will. Callum was the reliable one in his family, the one who'd stayed in town after his father died, who kept paying his mother's homeowner's insurance when she let it lapse, who still called his sister on her birthday even the year she didn't call back. Camille ran a boutique 2 towns over that had been losing money since the week it opened. I knew that much because Callum had mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd asked him for a loan last spring and he'd said no, and neither of us had brought it up again. I didn't know yet that he'd quietly changed his mind 3 weeks before his collapse, wiring her $4,000 from an account I didn't check often. That detail wouldn't surface for another week, and when it did, it would hurt in a way I hadn't braced for. Not because of the money, but because he hadn't told me. I like to think we had a good marriage. I kept the books for a 3-dentist practice across town, 3 days a week, the kind of job where you notice when a number is off by $4, let alone $4,000, a skill that would matter more than I could have guessed, and one I'd feel foolish about not using sooner. We argued about the dishwasher and whether Bodhi was old enough for a phone, not about anything that mattered. None of that was on my mind yet. Standing in that kitchen with the chipped mug rolling in a slow circle on the tile, and my husband's body jerking against the cabinets, I called 911. I don't remember what I said. I remember our neighbor's dog barking through the fence the whole time, and thinking, absurdly, that I still needed to finish the grocery list stuck to the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a lighthouse we'd bought on our honeymoon. Camille arrived at the hospital before I'd even called her. A nurse had pulled an old emergency contact card from Callum's file, one from years before Bodhi was born, back before I existed to her at all. She didn't ask how her brother was doing. She stood in the doorway of the ICU waiting room in a blazer like she'd come from a meeting, and asked who had power of attorney. I told her it was me. Callum and I had signed the paperwork 4 years earlier, after his father's heart gave out and left the family scrambling over a will nobody had updated since 2003. Camille smiled at me like I'd made a joke. I told myself it was shock talking. People say strange things in hospital corridors. Some pamphlet a chaplain had pressed into my hand said as much. I told myself Camille just needed something to control because there was nothing else left to control, and I let it go. 2 nights later, I woke up on the fold-out chair beside Callum's bed to find her standing at the foot of it, scrolling through her phone, the blue light lighting her face from underneath. She wasn't holding his hand. She wasn't looking at him at all. When she noticed I was awake, she slid the phone into her pocket and told me, too brightly, that she'd just been checking the time. My stomach dropped, the way it does right before you understand something you don't want to understand yet. I didn't say anything. I closed my eyes and pretended to fall back asleep, and I listened to her heels click out of the room 4 minutes later. On day 5, Camille started bringing Callum tea, a stainless steel thermos of ginger tea, brewed at home, that she insisted on carrying up herself every afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. Callum couldn't drink it. He was still on a feeding tube, but she said it was for his spirit, that ginger had healing properties, that she'd read about it online. I thought it was strange. I thought grief made people strange. I let it go. It was that same same afternoon in the hospital cafeteria that she said the thing that changed everything. We were in line for coffee. Real coffee, not the tea she was so devoted to for her comatose brother, and she said it loud enough that 3 tables of strangers turned to look. Everyone in the family knows that boy doesn't look a thing like Callum. I felt the blood leave my face. I asked her quietly what she meant. She didn't lower her voice to answer. She said Bodhi had my coloring, sure, but nothing of Callum's, not his jaw, not his hands, nothing, and that she'd wondered about it for years and never said anything out of respect. But with Callum unable to speak for himself, somebody had to protect the family's interests. I could have screamed at her in that cafeteria. Instead, something colder took over. The part of me that had spent 9 years married into a family that ran on plausible deniability. Fine, I said. Let's do the test. I said yes because I had nothing to hide, and because some small, ugly part of me wanted to watch her face when the results came back. What I didn't understand yet was that Camille's timing bothered me more than her accusation did, and I couldn't have told you why. 3 days later, a process server found me in the hospital parking garage before I'd even reached my car. He handed me a manila envelope and asked me to sign a clipboard like I was accepting a package. Inside was an emergency petition. Camille had gone to court asking to be named temporary guardian of Callum's estate, citing his incapacity and, in her lawyer's careful language, concerns regarding the management of marital assets during the respondent's incapacitation. I read it twice in my car before I understood what it meant. She wasn't only questioning Bodhi's paternity, she was asking a judge to hand her control of our accounts, our house, Callum's retirement fund, while he couldn't say a word to stop her. I hired Rosalind Kessler that afternoon on a co-worker's recommendation, a probate attorney with a corner office and a reputation, I was told, for eating guardianship cases for breakfast. Rosalind read the petition once, set it down, and asked me a question I hadn't thought to ask myself. How had Camille found a lawyer and filed emergency paperwork within 72 hours of her brother's stroke? That kind of speed, she said, doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone's already been talking to an attorney about something else, for some other reason, long before the reason everyone thinks they have. That night, I finally opened the joint banking app I hadn't checked in over a week. I'd been living out of a cafeteria and a fold-out chair, and bills were the last thing on my mind. I found the $4,000 wire transfer to Camille, sent 3 weeks before Callum's collapse. My husband, who had told her no to a loan last spring, had apparently changed his mind and hadn't told me. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the bottom of the statement, and not from fear this time. It was something smaller and pettier, and it made me ashamed even as I felt it. Hurt that he'd kept something from me on top of everything else. I didn't get to ask him about it. That was its own kind of cruelty. Camille started working the family behind my back after that, and she was good at it. My mother-in-law, Marguerite, called me on a Thursday to ask, gently, if maybe I'd gotten ahead of myself, marrying Callum so quickly 9 years ago. As if 9 years were quick, as if she hadn't stood 2 feet from me at our wedding. I just want to understand the whole picture, she said, when I asked her outright what Camille had told her. Nobody's accusing anyone of anything. Then why does it feel like everyone already has an opinion? I asked. She didn't answer that. She asked instead if I'd eaten anything that day, the way people do when they'd rather the conversation be about anything else. And I realized, with a slow, sinking feeling, that Camille had been feeding her a picture for weeks. At the dinner, the family still held every year on Desmond Price Sr.'s birthday. 2 years after he'd passed, Camille stood up mid-toast, tapped her glass, and said she just wanted the family to stay honest with each other going forward. She was looking directly at me when she said it. Nobody at that table defended me. I sat there and finished a plate of cold chicken while relatives I'd known for nearly a decade toasted my sister-in-law for her loyalty to a brother she hadn't visited in 2 years before he collapsed. I called Rosalind the next morning, my voice tight in a way I didn't recognize. She told me something that stuck with me the rest of that week. Guardianship cases aren't won in a courtroom first. They're won in a family group chat, in a string of birthday dinners, in 100 small conversations that make a judge's eventual decision feel like it was inevitable all along. Camille wasn't building a legal case yet. She was building a narrative, one relative at a time. And I was the only person in the room who seemed to notice she was doing it on purpose. I started documenting everything after that. Every phone call, every strange comment, every time she showed up somewhere she had no reason to be. It felt paranoid. It also felt increasingly like the only thing keeping me sane. One afternoon, I came back from the vending machines to find Camille crouched next to Bodhi's coloring book on the family lounge floor, asking him in a sing-song voice whether Daddy ever looked at him funny, like he didn't quite recognize him. Bodhi, to his enormous credit, just said Daddy always recognized him and went back to coloring a stegosaurus. I didn't let her within 10 feet of him without me in the room again, and I didn't tell Rosalind about it for 3 more days because saying it out loud made it feel more real than I was ready ready for. By the second week, something about Callum's condition stopped making sense. Dr. Priya Anand, the neurologist overseeing his care, told me his vitals kept dipping in ways that didn't track with a stroke recovering on schedule. Brief spikes in heart rate, unexplained drops in his numbers late in the afternoon, always late in the afternoon, always a few hours after visiting hours started. She used the word atypical twice in one conversation, which from a physician with 14 years in neurocritical care felt like an alarm bell dressed up in a lab coat. I started watching the clock. Camille arrived every day at 2, thermos in hand, and left by 3:30. Callum's numbers dipped, without fail, sometime around 4. I told myself I was losing my mind. Grief does that. I'd nodded along in the family counseling session the hospital offered. I knew paranoia was a documented stage of watching someone you love hover between two worlds. I told myself Camille was strange and cruel and grasping, but that didn't make her dangerous. Strange wasn't the same as dangerous. I made myself believe that for 3 more days. Then I watched her wash the thermos herself in the family lounge sink on a Wednesday morning when she thought no one was paying attention. Not the usual quick rinse, but a long, thorough scrub. Both hands, like she was washing away something specific. She dried it with a paper towel and set it back in her bag before Callum had even had his morning meds administered. My hands wouldn't stop shaking for an hour after that. I didn't confront her. I didn't know yet what I'd even be confronting her about. Instead, the next afternoon, while she was in the cafeteria buying her own coffee, I swapped the thermos in her bag for an identical one I'd bought at a kitchen supply store the night before, and hid the real one, unwashed this time, in a Ziploc bag in my purse. I told myself I was being paranoid right up until the moment I mentioned it to Rosalind, and she didn't laugh. Instead, she asked me a question that changed the shape of everything. Had anyone run a full toxicology panel on Callum since he'd been admitted? I asked Nurse Colleen Marsh, the charge nurse on Callum's floor, the next morning. She checked his chart and told me, apologetically, that the ER only screened for common substances in stroke patients on intake: opioids, alcohol, a handful of standard flags. Nothing broader, unless a doctor specifically ordered it, and nobody had, because nobody had reason to. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that hospital policy required her to log every visitor who spent unsupervised time with a patient in Callum's condition, and that she'd already noted Camille's name in the file 3 separate times for staying past posted visiting hours. Nobody had ever asked to see that log. I asked to see it that day. The hospital wasn't eager to hand it over. A patient relations coordinator named Denise Okonkwo sat me down in a small office off the main lobby and explained, kindly but firmly, that staff weren't permitted to speculate about a visitor's intentions, and that restricting Camille's access without concrete evidence of wrongdoing could expose the hospital to a discrimination complaint. She wasn't unkind about it. She was careful in the specific way institutions are careful when a lawsuit feels more real to them than a poisoning does. I left her office understanding that nobody there was going to help me until I could hand them something they couldn't explain away. Rosalind had reason to ask for more than the log. Since we were already moving forward with the court-ordered paternity test, Camille's petition had made it official, a court reporter scheduled and everything, set for the following Monday. Rosalind explained that under our state's guardianship statute, the forensic lab pulling blood for a contested paternity case could be authorized to run a comprehensive panel from the same draw, standard procedure in contested estate cases where a party's medical circumstances were already in dispute. It would cover everyone involved. It would cover Callum, too. Camille didn't object when Rosalind filed the request. I don't think she understood what it meant. I don't think at that point she was thinking about anyone but herself, and about a Friday hearing that was now circled on both our calendars for very different reasons. I brought Rosalind the thermos 2 days later, still in its Ziploc bag, my hands cold around it in her office. She didn't ask a single question about how I'd gotten it. She made a phone call instead, and 20 minutes later, a man named Detective Elias Reyes walked into her office and introduced himself with a handshake that felt more careful than friendly. Detective Reyes had 16 years with the department, the last 9 in the financial crimes and elder fraud unit, not homicide, which surprised me until he explained why he was already involved. 3 weeks before Callum's collapse, his unit had received an anonymous tip flagging irregularities in a life insurance claim filed 2 years earlier, after the death of Callum's father, Desmond Price Sr., ruled a sudden cardiac event at the time, natural causes. No toxicology ever run because nobody had reason to ask for one. Camille had been the primary beneficiary on that policy, tied to the family hardware store the 2 siblings had jointly inherited, a store she'd bought out Callum's half of within the year, using most of the payout, before running it into bankruptcy 18 months later and pivoting what remained into the boutique that was now failing too. The tip hadn't gone anywhere yet, Reyes told me. Insurance fraud tips rarely did, not without something concrete to attach them to. Then a 41-year-old man with no cardiac history had collapsed in his own kitchen, and his sister had filed emergency guardianship paperwork inside of 72 hours, and Reyes's unit had started paying closer attention. The original tip, he told me later, hadn't come from inside the family at all. It had come from a forensic accountant hired by one of the boutique's creditors, a man doing routine due diligence ahead of a debt settlement who'd noticed the insurance payout timeline lined up a little too neatly with the boutique's opening, and flagged it almost as an afterthought. Cases like this rarely started with someone suspecting murder, Reyes said. They started with someone someone suspecting money, and murder was just what turned up once somebody pulled that thread far enough. He'd sat in on a preliminary status conference 2 weeks earlier, the one where Camille's attorney had asked a court commissioner to temporarily restrict my hospital visitation on the grounds that I was interfering with Callum's care team's ability to make objective medical assessments. The commissioner had denied it outright, calling the request unusually aggressive for a spouse acting in apparent good faith. But Reyes said the attempt itself told him more than the denial did. People didn't try to separate a wife from her unconscious husband's bedside unless they had a reason to want fewer witnesses in the room. He took the thermos. He told me carefully that anything found in it wouldn't be admissible in court the way I'd collected it. No proper chain of custody, no witness, nothing but my word for where it had been. But it would tell them, unofficially, whether they were wasting their time or not. He was back 4 days later with an answer that wasn't unofficial anymore. Colchicine, the same compound sold in garden centers as an extract of autumn crocus, present in a residue coating the inside of the thermos in concentrations that had no business being anywhere near a beverage meant for a hospital patient. I remembered then something so small I'd never thought to mention it, that Camille's husband, Julian Voss, ran a small nursery and garden supply business 2 counties over, the same one Callum used to buy his tomato starts from every spring. I'd been there myself once, years earlier, admiring a bed of purple-flowered bulbs near the register that I'd assumed were tulips out of season. I told Reyes. He wrote it down without changing his expression, the way I imagined 16 years of hearing things that mattered more than they seemed to had taught him to. He also told me gently that he'd started a formal statement with me that same afternoon, my whole timeline, from the Sunday of the collapse to the morning I'd swapped the thermos, every date and detail recorded and signed. He said a case like this lived or died on a timeline that couldn't be picked apart later, and mine, he said, was unusually good for someone who hadn't known she was building one. The comprehensive toxicology panel from the court-ordered blood draw came back 12 days after Rosalind requested it, the same batch as the paternity results, run by Dr. Adais Namdi, a forensic toxicologist with the county crime lab who'd spent 9 years testifying in poisoning cases most people never hear about, because most poisoning cases never make the news. Her written report used phrases like acute colchicine toxicity and pattern consistent with repeated sublethal dosing over a period of 10 to 14 days, and one number that made Rosalind go quiet when she read it aloud. 20 times the concentration you'd expect from someone who'd simply eaten the wrong plant by accident. Dr. Namdi called Rosalind directly the morning the numbers came back, before the written report had even finished printing, because she said figures like that weren't the kind she liked sitting on overnight. She walked her through what a body does with repeated small doses of a compound like colchicine, how it accumulates instead of clearing, how it can produce exactly the kind of late afternoon dip in a patient's vitals that Dr. Anand had been quietly logging for 2 weeks without an explanation. When I finally told Dr. Anand what the panel had found, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the word atypical made a great deal more sense to her now than it had at the time. Somewhere in those 12 days, I learned one more thing Camille had been managing without telling me. She'd started an online fundraiser 3 days after Callum's collapse, Callum's Recovery Fund, and by the time Rosalind's request came back, it had raised just over $42,000. Camille controlled the account. When I finally asked to see how the money was being spent, her lawyer sent a one-line email saying disbursement records would be provided if and when appropriate. Rosalind said that alone was worth mentioning to Reyes, and he wrote that down too. Rosalind scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday, both results delivered together, with Camille present, because under the terms of her own petition, she was legally entitled to see them. I asked Rosalind if that was wise. She told me it was the only way to see, in real time, whether Camille already knew what was coming. The guardianship hearing was set for the Friday right after. Judge Warren Castellano's clerk had confirmed it twice. If the results came back too late or got tangled in some procedural delay, Camille stood a real chance of walking into that courtroom and walking out with legal control over Callum's accounts, his medical decisions, his house, before anyone could prove what she'd done to him. I had days, not weeks, and I spent most of them not sleeping. The Sunday before that meeting, Bodhi asked me when Aunt Camille was coming back to visit, and I didn't have an answer that wasn't a lie. I told him she was busy. He asked if Daddy was going to wake up before his birthday, 6 weeks away, and I told him I didn't know, because I didn't. And I'd promised myself a long time ago that I wouldn't lie to him about the things that mattered. My knees actually buckled once, in the hospital elevator, when a stranger complimented Bodhi's dinosaur backpack and asked, innocently, if his daddy liked dinosaurs too. It was such an ordinary question. I had to grab the handrail to stay upright. Monday, the paternity blood draw happened on schedule. A court reporter in the room, a technician swabbing Bodhi's cheek while he asked if it would hurt, and I told him no, and this time I wasn't lying. Camille sat across the room with her lawyer, arms crossed, watching my son like he was evidence in a case against her, instead of a 7-year-old who liked dinosaurs and hated peas. I couldn't breathe right for most of that week. My hands wouldn't stop shaking at odd moments, brushing Bodhi's hair, signing a permission slip for school, sitting beside Callum's bed listening to the ventilator's steady, patient rhythm. Dr. Anand told me his numbers had actually improved slightly since Camille's visits had tapered off in the tension after the guardianship filing. I didn't tell her why I thought that might be. Not yet. Rosalind had told me to say nothing to anyone in the family until the results were in hand. hand. Not because she doubted me, but because a case built on colchicine residue and a stolen thermos could fall apart if Camille got even one day's warning to explain it away, hide something else, or simply disappear. Marguerite called twice that week. I let both go to voicemail. In the first, her voice was stiff, asking if I'd heard anything back yet from the lab, careful not to say which one. In the second, 2 days later, she didn't mention any lab at all. She just asked if Bodhi needed anything for school, and something in her tone had softened in a way I didn't understand yet and wouldn't let myself hope about. I didn't call her back either time. Rosalind's instructions were the only thing keeping my mouth shut, and some days that was the hardest part of the entire month. Wednesday, Rosalind called with news that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. Both lab results were finished, a full day ahead of schedule. She wanted everyone in her office Thursday morning. Me, Camille, Camille's lawyer, and Detective Reyes, who'd asked to be present the moment he heard the toxicology numbers. It was Thursday or never. If we waited until Friday's hearing to make any of this public, Camille's attorney could argue that the guardianship petition and the criminal matter were separate issues entirely, drag out the timeline, buy her weeks to prepare a defense while a judge decided whether she got legal control over my husband's life in the meantime. Rosalind wanted the truth on the table a full day before Judge Castellano ever picked up his gavel, so there'd be nothing left for Camille to walk into court and still call a family disagreement. I didn't sleep at all Wednesday night. I sat in the dark beside Callum's bed and told him quietly that I was about to do something I couldn't take back, and that I hoped when he woke up, when, not if, I made myself say when, he wouldn't hate me for how I'd learned the truth about his sister. My throat was too tight to say much more than that. He didn't answer. The ventilator kept its rhythm. I held his hand until the sun came up. Rosalind's office smelled like coffee and new carpet at 10 that Thursday morning. Camille arrived 12 minutes late in a courtroom blazer, already smiling at me the way she had the day she asked who had power of attorney, like she'd already won something. Her lawyer sat beside her with a leather folder he never opened. Detective Reyes sat quietly near the window, unremarkable, exactly the way I imagined 16 years of interviews had taught him to be. Rosalind had 2 envelopes on the table when we all sat down. She opened the paternity results first, because that was the one everyone in the room believed they already knew the answer to. 99.99% probability of paternity. Callum Price, biological father of Bodhi Price, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt tired and old and angry in a way that had been sitting in my chest for a month with nowhere to go. Camille's smile didn't move. Her hand did. A small tremor against the folder in her lap. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it. I was. There's a second result, Rosalind said. She slid the toxicology report across the table. I watched Camille read the word colchicine 3 times before her face changed, before she understood this wasn't paperwork about her nephew at all. That's absurd, she said. Too fast, too loud for a room that size. He could have eaten something wrong. Who even tests for that? The lab did, Rosalind said, because you insisted the court authorize a comprehensive panel to protect the estate. You asked for this specifically, in writing, to make sure nothing was being hidden from you. Camille's face went the color of the report in her hands. Detective Reyes stood then, unhurried, and asked her a single question. Where had she bought the ginger tea she'd been bringing her brother every afternoon for 2 weeks? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. He set a small evidence bag on the table. Inside it was a stainless steel thermos, not the one she'd scrubbed so carefully in the family lounge sink, believing she'd erased whatever had been inside it, but the one I'd swapped it for without her ever noticing the difference. This tested positive for colchicine residue, Reyes said, consistent with the concentration found in your brother's blood. Camille's chair scraped back hard enough that it nearly tipped. You had no right. Your sister-in-law had every right to keep a thermos sitting in her own kitchen, Rosalind said. What you didn't have the right to do was poison a man in a hospital bed and then wash the evidence in a public sink. Reyes wasn't finished. In the same unhurried voice, he told her his unit had reopened the file on Desmond Price Sr.'s death that morning. 2 years old, ruled natural causes at the time. No toxicology ever run because nobody had thought to ask for one. He told her the state crime lab had located preserved tissue samples from her father's autopsy, standard retention procedure, and that they'd be tested for the same compound within the week. And he told her that a search warrant had been executed that same morning, timed to hit at the exact hour this meeting began, at the home and nursery she shared with her husband Julian. Because if she was going to hear the results in this room, Reyes hadn't wanted to give her a single unsupervised phone call in between to warn anyone or dispose of anything. That's when her phone lit up on the table between us. She looked down. Every bit of color still left in her face drained out completely. I saw the name on the screen before she turned it face down. Julian. Underneath it, a text that had already come through. The kind you can't unread once you've seen it. They found the second bottle. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. Camille didn't move fast enough to hide it from any of us. Her lawyer reached over and turned the phone face down himself, a beat too late, his jaw tight in a way that told me he understood exactly how much worse this had just become for his client. A second bottle, Reyes said quietly, means this wasn't one bad afternoon. It means whoever bought it bought enough for more than one dose. I needed help, Camille said suddenly, to no one in particular, her voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard from her in 9 years. He always had everything. The house, the job, the wife who actually She stopped herself there. Nobody in the room finished the sentence for her, and nobody needed to. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Camille sat very still, staring at the table, and I thought about the birthday dinner where she'd stood up and told the whole family to stay honest with each other, looking directly at me while she said it. Everyone in the family, I said, before I decided to say anything at all, is about to know exactly what you are. She didn't answer. There wasn't anything left for her to say. Reyes arrested her in the parking lot outside Rosalind's building 40 minutes later. Attempted murder, plus 11 counts of administering a poison to a hospitalized patient, 1 count for every afternoon. The hospital's visitor log showed her walking in with that thermos. Bail was set at $250,000. Julian wasn't charged with anything. The wholesale supplier's receipts showed Camille had been the one placing the colchicine orders through his business account 4 months running before Callum ever collapsed. Judge Castellano dismissed the guardianship petition the following morning in under 2 minutes, on the record, noting for the file that it had been filed in apparent bad faith. Callum's numbers started climbing the week Camille stopped visiting, and kept climbing after that. Doctor, Annan won't give me a timeline. 14 years of not promising things she can't guarantee has made her careful that way, but she told me last Tuesday that his latest scan looked, in her words, genuinely encouraging, and it was the first time I'd seen her smile since the morning we met. I still sit in that fold-out chair some nights, holding his hand, telling him things I'm not sure he can hear yet. Last week I told him his son has his hands, exactly his hands, down to the way his thumb bends a little too far back. I told him the lab had proof now, printed, signed, notarized, of something I never needed proof of at all. Then I turned off the light, and I stayed until morning, the way I always do.